What's up, everyone? Gerry Thompson here. Just got back from Columbus, SCG Invitational, where I finished in the top 8, locked up my spot for the Players' Championship, so we're feeling good. I got Pro Tour this weekend. SOI is out on Magic Online, and everything is great. Just great. So, the deck that I played at the Invitational was White-Blue Humans, and it is a deck that I think that most people would not have pegged me to play, just because this doesn't really seem like my style. I've been more like mid-range as of late, and in my olden days, I was playing a lot of control decks, but honestly, I have a real soft spot for these kind of like mid-rangey, smaller white decks that aren't hyper-aggressive, but have a lot of defensive elements, a lot of removal and card advantage stuff, and basically what this deck tries to do is just like slowly put your opponent in a noose and just strangle them. And I kind of love that. So against most decks in the format, you basically just like play out some small creatures. Flip card, Town Gossipmonger, also have Kithian, Thraben Inspector, pump them up with Thali's Lieutenant or Always Watching, or a Gideon Emblem, and basically just control the board, use Declaration in Stone, Stasis Snare, Reflector Mage to keep anything problematic off the table, and just slowly make your board bigger than theirs, and eventually they'll just succumb. So this is not like a balls-out, hyper-aggressive deck like Max McVitie used to win the tournament. I'm not playing what I would consider to be bad cards, like Dragon Hunter or Expedition Envoy, because those cards are pretty bad in a field of 2/3s and 3/3s out of the Band Company decks, so I was not a big fan of those. There's certainly an argument to be made that, like, Thali's Lieutenant and Always Watching pump up your things, and, like, you can have Grip Spoon to give them evasion and stuff, so, like, they're not that bad. But at the same time, like, I didn't want my mid-game to just be drawing, like, an excess 1-mana 2/1 creature that I didn't really need, so I tried to do what I could to just cut all the quote-unquote bad cards out of the deck, go a little bit bigger, have a little bit more of a robust game plan here. So, I guess we should talk about Town Gossipmonger, because this is the one that seems like this suicidally aggressive creature, but it's really not, because it's so big. It's a 1-mana 2/3 that also gets bigger. Like, this card is actually just ridiculous on rate, and I love it. It is so good. You also get to pick and choose when you want to actually turn it over. Most games, I'll just play it on turn 1, play a 2-drop, and then flip it immediately. But if they start with like a 2/2 first striker, and if I know that if they have an Always Watching, I'm just going to have to suicide my Gossipmonger, I'm not going to transform it. So you actually do have a lot of play with this card, and you get to pick and choose when you want to actually get aggressive with it. I would say that most times I just flip it over immediately and just get to work, just because it is so difficult to block this thing. But yeah, you certainly have options. Thraben Inspector, just great. Basically White Elvish Visionary. 1/2 is just like also very generous. I don't really get that, I guess, but making this a 2/3 and then a 3/4 is huge, because not only does it just like block Sylvan Advocate, but once it's a 3/4, it can also just like attack through Bounding Crassus. So Inspector is great, and once you have some spare mana, you actually just get to turn it into a card. So this is basically just like a free piece of cardboard, which is great. Kithian is reasonable. It is very, very similar to Expedition Envoy in most games, but there are also games where you actually just transform it into Gideon Battleforged, and you slowly pick apart their board that way by forcing them to attack into your bigger creatures. So Kithian also has the upside of being pretty good against burn spells. So like if you play against Todd's Blue-Red Goggle deck, a late-game Kithian is actually just fine. It's completely reasonable just because of the activated ability. There is some tension there now that I have Gideon, Ally of Zendikar in the main deck, where we end up just with 5 Gideons in our deck. And sometimes that does come up, certainly. But you can generally mitigate that by maybe cashing in Ally of Zendikar for an emblem, and then getting into combat and transforming into Gideon Battleforged with Kithian. So it ends up not being that bad, you know? Thali's Lieutenant, just great. There were some games where I would, play a 1-drop and then maybe 2 1-drops or a 2-drop, and then turn 3, play a 1-drop into Thali's Lieutenant, and that's just great. And then any human you draw past that is also going to pump the Lieutenant. But there are also some games where you just play 1-drop, and then you play Lieutenant, and then you slowly grow the Lieutenant because you have a slower hand. Maybe you have a bunch of reflector mages or something. So Lieutenant is basically good early, good late. Hallmark of a great card there, kind of. So definitely playing 4 of those. Also trying to keep in mind that in order to make the lieutenants good, you need to have like a high enough density of humans. So you end up still having 11 1-drops despite kind of cutting the mopey cards. And then we have Knight of the White Orchid, which is just phenomenal. It is so good in this deck. It's the card that makes it so you don't care whether or not you win or lose the die roll. It is so good. And a lot of the games, even if you are on the play, you might just play a lieutenant, one of the 2 different lieutenants on turn 2, and then just skip your land drop, just to get an extra land drop and then maybe curve right up to Avacyn. So Knight of the White Orchid is phenomenal. First striking creatures are just boss in the mirror match with any +1/+1 thing. And yeah, I think that's about it about Knight. I mean, like, this is just a card that like you don't sideboard out. Like it is kind of untouchable. There are certainly times where it's like, all right, I don't need this many 2-drops in my deck or whatever. If you're playing against, I don't know, something with a bunch of sweepers and you're on the play, it is kind of mopey there. But oftentimes, like I said, I'll just skip my second land drop, and then if they want to play that game with me, by all means, But yeah, most of the time you're getting a land with this thing, which is pretty insane. Consul's Lieutenant is my second first striker in the deck. I'm not going super hard on these things, but I do think 2 is pretty reasonable. This is probably the card that I side out the most, just because in removal-heavy matchups, this thing doesn't really get the job done because you're not going to be able to take advantage of the Renown very much, just because your board's not going to be very big. So also, most people just like board in a bunch of removal against you because your deck is full of creatures. So this thing tends to hit the bench. But again, first strike, very powerful in these creature mirrors. You give this thing +1/+1. It's attacking through Sylvan Advocate, and it does its job pretty well. Reflector Mage is the card that I'm splashing for. Knight of the White Orchid makes it pretty easy, which is another plus side of that card. And Reflector Mage is just kind of bomb. You just punish anyone for playing things like Kalitas or Mindrack Demon. Just these big mopey creatures that don't have ETBs. Reflector Mage is also just really big. 2/3 is pretty insane for a 3-mana creature, especially with something that has this effect, that is this powerful. And once you give it +1/+1, boom. Just trades with Chandra. That's kind of like step 1 against those decks, is to find a Gossip Monger or a Reflector Mage, get it to 4 toughness, make it so their Chandra is just a clean sweeper and not something that they can play, wipe your board, and still have a Planeswalker with. So certainly helps there. Also just makes it so you don't have to play that much removal. Like, you can just jam this on turn 3 if they're not playing creatures, and it's perfectly reasonable. But if you didn't have a Reflector Mage, like if we were mono white, I would want like some more Silk Wraps or something. And Reflector Mage means that you don't have to actually play those. You don't actually need to kill most things. You're only worried about what is on the board. So you're basically playing this game where you're trying to build a bigger board than them. And around like turn 4, turn 5 is kind of the real turning point where you start putting them in such a big hole that they can't come back from. And Reflector Mage kind of is the best of both worlds, where it adds to your board and takes away from theirs, and means that you don't need to kill any of their creatures, just because like having them pick it up is actually just kind of better than killing it, especially since you get a body attached to it. Like we could try and kill everything, but that's not really this deck's game plan. So Stasis Snare is a little clunky, not great in the deck, but it is the one thing that kind of allows you to attack into an Archangel Avacyn. Sniffing out Avacyn is generally pretty easy. It's a little more difficult against things that also have Collected Company because, then they're representing any number of different things. But Stasis Snare is generally the one thing that you can have where you have like 3 creatures, they have 1, their creature is going to trade off with your creature, and then if they play Avacyn, they basically just like 2 for 0 you, which is a disaster. But if you actually have Stasis Snare, you're generally making that push to get in a bunch of damage, and it just kind of like insulates you from Avacyn, which is really nice because this deck doesn't really have a lot of instant speed interaction otherwise. So I do like the snares in the deck. Like I said, they are kind of mopey. 3 is pretty expensive for this effect, but I do think that Flash is very important, and again, like this deck is not super fast. We are not swarming all that well. It is very rare that we're able to make like these alpha strikes just to get in the last few points of damage. You really do have to be concerned about what your opponent has on board and trying to keep their board contained, and Stasis Snare does a good job of that. because otherwise Avacyn would probably throw a pretty big wrench into your plans. And then we have 3 Always Watching. Not a lot of these. I think most people would be pretty surprised that I'm only playing 3 of this card because the card is just phenomenal. But with Stone, Snare, Gideon, Avacyn, that is enough cards, I think, that I could have in my opening hand to slow me down and make it so my board is actually not that big or I'm not curving out that well. And Always Watching is pretty bad in multiples in those situations. And I also just wanted to play Gideons, which give me more of the emblem effect, the +1/+1 to all your team, the anthem effect, I guess. So I felt, I don't know, I didn't play Gideon at the Invitational. I added them after the fact, and that's a whole nother thing that I'll get into. I did only play 3 Always Watching, but I did feel like I wanted more anthems, so the Gideons are in the deck for that now. But there could certainly be a 4th Always Watching if you did not want to play Gideon. But yeah, a couple weeks ago, I wrote an article saying that Gideon was basically not good. It is a card that is basically only good on the play in most decks, because otherwise, if you're on the draw, you can't really defend it all that well, and slowly your board position is just going to crumble, and you're going to end up spending your mana on a 2/2 and a fog, effectively, which is not a good way to get back in the game. However, this deck gets on the board quickly, can defend its Gideons, its creatures are pretty big, and Gideon is actually very, very good in this deck. If it were not good in the format, then I would not want to play Gideon, but I do actually just like Gideon as either an emblem or a thing that makes a 2/2 and an emblem, or just like this big powerful beater that they can't really stop. It is really nice to have a board gummed up against like the Band Company matchup, for example, and then just be able to +1 your Gideon and send it in there, because like they don't have any profitable blocks. They very, very rarely get something to 6 toughness. You know, that's like an Advocate and 2 Dromoka's commands or whatever. Their creatures are pretty small. They don't have a good way to stop Gideon once you've actually stabilized the board. A lot of the Band Company decks now are not playing very many flying creatures. So Gideon, again, is certainly much, much better on the play than on the draw. But at the same time, I think it is good enough on the draw because of how low our mana curve is that we'll be able to protect it, or at the very least get a lot of mileage out of just playing it and using the emblem. So I like the idea of playing Gideon in my main deck. I did side in a lot, and it was not. It was even in spots where my sideboard plans did not have it coming in. Like, for example, against Band Company, it was like I figured out kind of like halfway through the tournament that on the play I just wanted to hammer them, and I wanted Gideon in my deck. Because it was this really potent threat when I was on the play, and having more anthems was very important, and maybe shaving that last Always Watching was not the smartest thing, but hey, you know, it ended up working out. So now we're going to try these in the main deck again, and I'm pretty confident that they're just going to be good. So the downside there is that once you start adding things like Gideon and more removal spells and Always Watching and big things like Avacyn, the Bygone Bishops that I had in my deck become much less effective. So I had to cut those. It's pretty sad because being able to grind people out post-board was kind of part of my plan, but we have a different plan now, so the Bishops are out. And then at the top end, in our little white weenie deck, we have a 5-mana Angel that kind of just does it all. We don't have a lot of tricks with Avacyn. We don't have Displacer. We don't have Eily. We don't have any way to really kill our own creatures. But just, it's Avacyn. It's really good. And you just, because of the Knights, you end up playing these games where you just get to 5 mana pretty easily. So clues also help. Thraben Inspector helps getting to 5 a lot also. But yeah, Avacyn is this thing that allows you to make these kind of like desperation alpha strikes. Generally, you're the one that is being the aggressor, and you know you're probably not going to dip below 15 or so. Like they're not going to get you for a lot of damage unless things are going very poorly for you, and that allows you to just make this alpha strike, play Avacyn. Maybe they lose a creature or whatever, but you get in some damage. And you don't lose any part of your board position. And again, it's another one of those things where like their board position crumbles. I also had this where like my opponent had a Gossip Monger that was forced to attack, and I just got to chump with a Thraben Inspector, flip my Avacyn, and wipe their board. So there are certainly ways to trigger Avacyn. Like the turn you play it, you get in for some damage, maybe kill a creature, and then the next turn you get to attack with everyone again. And then if they try and eat your creatures, then you just get to flip your Avacyn, destroy their board. So I mean, Avacyn is great. It does a lot of stuff. It's also just very, very potent against decks with Chandra, Red-Green, Eldrazi, Ramp. has Chandra, Kozilek's Return, Dragonlord Atarka, like Avacyn just kind of like does it all, and it is a card that I would consider playing more of. The games tend to slow down in the post-board games, so for a while I had a third Avacyn in my sideboard. I can't really see playing more than that main deck because, again, like you kind of need to have like a cohesive curve to actually function, but Avacyn is very, very good. I was very happy with the 2 copies I had in my deck, so we're staying with that. Mana base is pretty normal. I have 8 dual lands. I have 4 Knights to fetch Prairie Stream, and I have kind of the Miser's Island, which is my 9th or 13th blue source, depending on how you look at it, because there were a few too many games I played where I didn't have mana for Reflector Mage, so I thought that 21 white was enough for this deck, and the island is kind of just like this colorless land that helps you cast Reflector Mage. So I'm fine with that. I've heard multiple reports from people where they say the island has screwed them and they wish it was a plains and yada yada yada, but I don't know. It's been more than fine for me. I think you need it for some of your sideboard cards also, because you definitely want to play blue cards in your sideboard. It's part of the reason why we're splashing. So let's look at that. My sideboard for the Invitational was much different. I had Dragonlord Ojutai to go along with Always Watching against Todd's Goggles deck because I thought that deck would be a little more prevalent, and it was certainly there. It did show up, and Dragonlord Ojutai Always Watching is just kind of game against them. They can't really do much to it because it has 5 toughness, it's hexproof, it finds you more counter spells like Negate to protect it against whatever they got going on, or maybe find you a removal spell for their Thing in the Ice. But I don't think those decks are big enough to actually warrant having that card. So instead, I'm just going to play a Gideon with some Gideon's main deck and hope that that's good enough alongside some counter spells. I had 3 negates at the Invitational. Now I have 2 negates, 3 dispels. I actually think I might want 2 dispel, 3 negate, but I know I want 3 counter spells against Bant Company, or at least that's what it felt like. So dispel is obviously better against them than negate is. But I do feel like you would not lose all that much by bringing in a negate, and then if they have something like Tragic Arrogance or Planar Outburst in their sideboard, then you at least have a card that can potentially answer that. So maybe 3 negate, 2 dispel is better. We have Tragic Arrogance, which again seems very out of place in my white creature deck, but my configuration post-board against things like Bant would generally involve cutting the 7 1-drops that aren't very good in games where I'm a little behind, games where they might be stabilized, and I would basically just draw cards with Bygone Bishop while they develop their board, hit them with the Tragic Arrogance, then unload my hand, and that plan worked pretty well up until I got to the top 8, and my opponent's on my deck list, and all my secrets were out. So I still think Arrogance is good, especially since the Boss Human deck and the deck that Max McVitie won with are both pretty similar. They have 18 to 20 lands, a ton of 1-drops, and they just try and swarm you. They're effectively like a Sly deck, and Arrogance is basically like one of the best cards you can have against them. It's also a card that allows you to transform your Avacyn if that matters. It's one of the few things that can actually flip it. So that's cool. But if you don't have Arrogance, you basically need to build a bigger board than them with Always Watching and maybe having a first striker. Just making sure you have more +1/+1s. You got to keep them notched, and then they won't have any favorable attacks, and eventually you'll just be able to kill them. But barring that, Tragic Arrogance is probably the best card to have against them because they go so wide, and I might even consider having a third copy. Other Gideon I talked about. Could definitely see this being main deck because I was really impressed with Gideon in this deck, but I'm fine with having it in the sideboard for now. I don't want my opening hands to have a bunch of clunky cards. And then I'm trying some other stuff. Against Bant Company, I know that Grifspoon is very, very good. I wanted to try it in this deck just because the Always Watchings were very good, but could fall victim to Dramoka's command, but Grifspoon allows you to kind of protect yourself against that, which is pretty cool. Plus having flying is really good. You end up having enough mana to reattach this several times if, say, they Reflector Mage your creature or whatever. I do think Grifspoon is great, and in any matchup like Bant Company, I think just having flying is really important. And this card is just like so good, so efficient. And then we have some Silk Wraps, which I like against Bant if I'm doing this Grifspoon thing. Can basically, if I'm on the draw, I can probably cut like the Stasis Snares, maybe, the Consul's Lieutenants, the Gideons, maybe the Kithians too, because Kithian is still not very good against them, regardless of how many +1/+1s you have. Like, you need 3 or whatever to make it actually really good, because generally you're spending your mana on other stuff. And then when I'm on the draw, I would like to be able to like kill their 2-drop, whether it be a Duskwatch Recruiter or Sylvan Advocate, maybe a Jace. And then Griff Spoon on turn 3 will just allow you to protect yourself from Dramoka's command. So I'm going to try that plan. Instead of doing the grindy thing with Bygone Bishop and Tragic Arrogance, I'm just going to try and beat him down. So we'll see how that works. But yeah, deck tech was pretty long. Have a lot to talk about because I've played with this deck a lot. I had some pretty good success with it in the Invitational. I went 7-1 in the Swiss. I lost a squeaker, a super close match to Band Company in the Swiss in round 4. Where maybe some mistakes were made. I know I definitely had a lot of decisions. I had Bygone Bishop going for a while. My opponent had a lot of stuff going on as well. I got them down pretty low, resolved a Tragic Arrogance, and then like things just kind of went south from there. Ended up flooding out, ran out of clues, and then my opponent drew like a string of pretty good cards, I think, just like collected companies and stuff. And then I had to cast another Tragic Arrogance, which was like not as good. It was just like I was kind of dead on board. And then like towards the end, it just came down to top decks. And pretty exciting game 3. Went to time, had a ton of play. Almost certainly could have done something differently to win that one. And then the top 8, I also lost to Band Company, where first couple games I mulliganed 6 on the play. My hands were not great. I think my hand in game 1 was certainly playable and potentially could have won, but I did some things that I didn't really agree with in hindsight based on how the game played out. So I don't know. Game 3 was the actual close one, and it ended with me not casting Tragic Arrogance on a turn where I thought if I didn't, he would probably develop his board a little bit more. But instead, he just fired up a creature land and hit me for a bunch of damage, which ended up being 7 damage, something like that. And then I cast Arrogance in 6 life, thought I was stabilized. Collected company into like maybe Bounding Crassus Reflector Mage, got in for another 3. I stabilized after that even, and then a kicked Planar Outburst killed me. So there you go. I wish I would have put up a little bit more of a fight in top 8, but hey, that's what the Pro Tour is for this weekend. So I'm working on this deck a little bit more, trying out different sideboard plans, and away we go.